Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza. So I want you to imagine the last time you moved into a new place. You went through the hassle of finding a place, you packed, you changed your cable and your utilities company, you signed up for everything, and all of these were, of course, things you were reminded to do by the new building manager when you moved in. But then a few weeks later, as everyone does, you realize you forgot to update your address, like your employer or the bank, and you fix it. You missed an important piece of mail, but that's really all the consequences you face. But now I want you to imagine that the consequence for that was an indefinite jail sentence. Maybe months, maybe longer. I know it sounds ridiculous, but believe it or not, this is exactly what is happening to thousands of people in New York State alone. Let's take Shawn Dunn, for example, the subject of a recent story by Elizabeth Weill-Greenberg for The Appeal. At nearly 60 years old, Shawn was incarcerated on Rikers Island in October of last year, and he was detained there for months in the middle of a pandemic for failure to report a change of address, missing a few meetings with his parole officer, and missing an 8 p.m. curfew. While Dunn was inside, his sister died. Because he couldn't produce his birth certificate, the jail would not let him go to the funeral. Across New York State, more than 35,000 people are under parole supervision as we speak. Only Illinois sends more people to prison for technical, non-criminal parole violations. And what's more, these technical violations in New York, missed meeting prosecutions, if you will, are actually more common than actual crime prosecutions. 6 times as many people in New York return to prison for technical parole violations as for new arrests. The price tag for taxpayers of this continual parole violation enforcement is more than $600 million every year. And of course, white people aren't really being impacted here. We are talking about people who are charged with technical violations of parole. We're talking about 60% Black and just under 30% Latinx, according to 2020 data. So why is New York State doing this? Why ruin people's lives over a missed meeting or a missed curfew? What on earth is the public safety argument here? Very happy to talk with that with an amazing group today. We're talking with State Senator Julia Salazar, who is introducing legislation to tackle this issue. Philip DeGrange, civil rights attorney at the Legal Aid Society, and of course, the Appeal's own Elizabeth Weill-Greenberg. I'm so happy to have you all here to join us. Thank you for coming on the show. So, Phil, I want to start with you because I have started in this introduction sort of like unpacking the harm that we're talking about here. But as you know, as I know, every arrest, no matter how minor or brief, can do terrible damage to a person's life. 24 hours in jail could be a missed shift at work and a lost job and no chance to get the rent money together and maybe loss of child custody. So I'm wondering if you can talk our audience through the sort of staggering life fallout that these technical violation missed meeting arrests can cause.
Sure. So to begin with, parole is supposed to provide an opportunity for people to regain their freedom and go back into the community with their families and loved ones and try and get back up on their feet. What happens in New York all too often, though, is parole functions more as a trap, where people, for the most menial reasons, like missing a curfew, failing to check in with a parole officer, or failing to report a change of address, are then issued a warrant where they're jailed on that warrant because of an alleged violation of parole. And the way it works in New York is you're automatically jailed until you have your trial to determine if you actually violated parole. So people spend 3-4 months in Rikers Island waiting for a trial without even having any basis to believe that they're a danger to the public. The state says that they do this for public safety reasons, but in all honesty, it makes no sense, because at the end of these trials, the vast majority, about 50% or more, are released because the state has determined that they are not a public safety risk. So we're detaining people in mass automatically because of the alleged public safety reasons, but ultimately these individuals are overwhelmingly found to pose no real risk to the public. The cost of these people's lives is really tremendous. People lose their jobs when they're spending 3-4 months in jail. They lose their apartments if they're paying rent and they're unable to do so while they're incarcerated. If they're in a homeless shelter, they'll lose their spot in that shelter and potentially be released back to the streets. And of course, if they're in any programming where they're taking substance abuse treatment or things like that, that can be interrupted as well. So in all honesty, the way parole works in New York is it's actually counterproductive to continue to incarcerate people for these menial reasons and disrupt their lives and make it more likely that they're going to return back to prison.
Thank you so much for that explanation. Yeah, this thinking about someone losing like their continuity in a substance use treatment or mental health treatment program for missing a curfew is like blowing my mind. Elizabeth, from your reporting, can you tell us what, I mean, I keep giving this missed curfew example, but I want to make sure we're being thorough. What kinds of violations are we talking about? What are the technical violations that are landing people behind bars?
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. That's a really great and a really important question. And, to be clear, what we're talking about are technical violations. So these are not new crimes. And I think that Mr. Dunn's case is really instructive on what this system looks like in practice. So Mr. Dunn, like you said, he missed his curfew. And to be clear, we're talking about a now 60-year-old man here. And he missed appointments with his parole officer, and he failed to report an address change. If he had failed to report, a change in employment, that could also be a technical parole violation. And for these violations, he was sentenced to 4 months on Rikers Island in the middle of a global pandemic. When I spoke with Mr. Dunn, he was still on Rikers. He was it was a few days before he was going to be released. And he said something, I think, that really quite powerful. He said when he was released on his underlying charge in 2017, he really hoped parole was going to help him. But instead, he said, it's done nothing other than threaten me with going back to prison.
You in on this conversation, especially as we're talking about like what actually makes people safer and what just disrupts everyone's lives and is the opposite. You are the chair of the Crime Victims and Corrections Committee in the New York State Senate. And I understand that you are declaring your support for the Less is More Act. Can you talk about what the new legislation is, what it would do?
Absolutely. The Less is More Act is a bill that was introduced by Senator Benjamin, a Manhattan state senator, that we passed the bill through the Crime Victims, Crime and Corrections Committee a couple of weeks ago. And it's now been referred to the Finance Committee in the state Senate, but it's making its way to the floor. And in New York, more than 35,000 people live under parole supervision right now. And those who are accused of technical violations, what Phil and Elizabeth described, they are detained while they wait for a probable cause hearing. That has to occur within 15 days of their arrest, but they're detained in the meantime. If probable cause is found, they are imprisoned until the revocation hearing, and then a judge determines if they violated parole. In recent years in New York, 65% of people who were reincarcerated for technical parole violations. So it really is a gross injustice. What this bill would do is it would restrict the use of incarceration for technical violations. So certain technical violations of parole could still result in jail time, but it would be capped at a maximum of 30 days. It would support due process. So rather than if someone has allegedly made a technical violation of their parole, rather than automatically being detained, they would be issued a written notice of violation with a date to appear in court, and they would still remain at liberty for any hearings. And if they were accused of a new criminal offense, then they would at least be afforded a recognizance hearing in a local criminal court before being detained. Additionally, the process of having a hearing would be faster. They would know when their hearing is upon the alleged violation, and they would know the conditions of their release. And additionally, people who are under community supervision would be eligible for earned time credits reduction in their community supervision period. And so all of these things collectively can help to minimize how much a technical parole violation can disrupt someone's life and minimize the reincarceration and recidivism that we are seeing as a result of the way that technical parole violations are currently handled in New York. It really would make a profound difference in so many people's lives.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that, Senator Salazar, because I think often when we talk about legislation that impacts people in the criminal legal system, people tend to think about just those people in the criminal legal system and forget that like the vast majority of people who are behind bars are also parents and colleagues and members of their communities and churchgoers, and like that there's this whole network of community attached to every single one of the people we're talking about today. So I'm wondering if you could just unpack a little bit the scale of this legislation. I mean, who is it going to impact? How many people could this legislation impact if it prevents incarceration for technical violations in some cases?
Sure. I mean, if we consider that 35,000 people are currently on parole or under community supervision in New York State, and then we consider that every single one of those people likely has someone in their life who would be impacted, whether it's even if it's their coworkers because they are reincarcerated and then unable to show up for work and potentially lose their job. You know, I know that in jobs that I've worked in the past, if I didn't show up, you know, if I was a no-show even one day, I would likely lose my job. And often people are being held, you know, even before there's any due process, they are being held for weeks, right? And so those people would be affected. And we think about families, right? For parents, children ending up in the foster care system as a result. The negative impact of keeping the law the way it is really profound. And so if we're looking at 35,000 people under community supervision, that has to be hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, in New York alone, who would be positively impacted and spared a lot of harm if we were to pass the Less is More Act.
Thank you for that. I want to turn now to Vincent Schiraldi, co-director of the Columbia University Justice Lab, who I did not introduce at the top because he has just joined us. It's like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood around here. Thank you for being a friend. Thank you for stopping by. But I want to talk with you because a lot of times when we talk about decarceration and legislation or policy changes that would get people out of jail, people like talk about safety in a way that kind of omits the safety of people who are living behind bars. Or they equate prison with safety in a way that isn't really borne out by the evidence. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the argument that using prisons this way on, you know, technical violations, minor things, using prisons as a slap on the wrist actually causes more harm and less safety.
Thank you for inviting me. I would have worn my cardigan if I'd known you were going to do the Mr. Rogers.
Me too.
I got my V-neck on instead. You know, it was fascinating listening to the bits of the conversation I caught on. I'm sorry for my technological lameness at the earlier part. But, you know, over the last year or so, I've been doing a lot of speaking about the issue of technical violations, both at the parole stage and at the probation stage. And I used to be commissioner of New York City probation. So I oversaw 30,000 people on probation, which is an upfront sentence that was designed to be an alternative as opposed to parole, which is at the back end after prison. And so on one panel I was on, there was a gentleman who had been revoked and in prison for a year because he married someone with a felony conviction. I was at another event of the Fortune Societies that was helping people re-enter from prison. And one of the guys was living in a homeless shelter, even though his mother had a room for him to live with her because she had a conviction and his parole officer wouldn't let him live with his mother. So he's living in a homeless shelter because he's not allowed to associate with people with criminal records. I spoke at a very renowned employment program, and the other person on the panel, we spoke to their board of directors, had been referred to the organization for help getting a job. They got him a good job, and it worked. It was in the evening though, and it was not a minimum wage job. It was actually a career path job that paid well above minimum wage. He asked his parole officer for permission to stay out past the 7 p.m. curfew. The parole officer said yes. There was 4 turnovers in parole officers in the first year the guy was out. The first 3 said yes. The 4th one just showed up at his apartment, knocked on his door, he wasn't home, and filed a warrant for his arrest. He said that when he went into Rikers, he was there 6 weeks. When the administrative law judge got the case, she returned him back to the community. But during that 6 weeks, he said when he went in, he had a job, a girlfriend, an apartment, and a car. And 6 weeks later, he had none of those things. He had to start all over from scratch. So, I can give you lots of data about how reducing technical violations does not negatively affect public safety. Missouri did it in big numbers and had no negative impact on public safety. California has shed 150,000 people from probation and parole rolls, and arrests have declined substantially in California as they did that. Those are big numbers, though. And when you look at it from the individual standpoint, can you imagine how disruptive it is that a guy who has a job and gets married spends a year in prison? Another person who's got a place to stay has to stay in a homeless shelter because of a parole rule. And another person who's got a job and is not reoffending is reincarcerated for 6 months and has to start all over again. This is craziness, and New York State does it more than any other state in the country. It would be one thing to say, we can't afford to do better than this, but we're spending $650 million to lock people up like this. And we really could use that money to be reallocated to help people thrive when they come out of prison, help them find jobs, help them find a place to live, help them with mental health and substance abuse treatment, rather than just wasting it on these technical violations, incarceration for these technical violations.
Yeah, it sounds like $650 million to just ruin people's lives in incredibly cruel ways. And I know also, in this year plus of global health crises, the consequences can be much worse. Phil, I'm wondering if you could talk to us for a minute about Michael Tyson and what happened to Michael Tyson.
Sure. So, his story is really reminiscent of others as well, who during the pandemic were unfortunately incarcerated on a technical parole violation. And of course, we're faced with a situation with a virus that spreads most easily in congregate settings where people are confined and are unable to isolate from others. And unfortunately, in his case, and in the case of others as well, in Rikers Island, he contracted the virus, and in his particular case, died from it. And it's really a tragedy that could have been easily avoided, in that the state was aware of the significant risk of coronavirus for people who are incarcerated. They're well aware of the fact that there's so many people who are in jail that don't need to be because they're in solely on technical parole violations that pose no risk to the public and could have been released. And we know the state knows this because later the governor did direct docs to release, I believe, nearly 700 people, about 600 people in Rikers Island alone who are in on technical parole violations. So, we've seen the state do this, but unfortunately, we just have seen too little and too late from the state, and it's unfortunately cost people their lives, cost people their health, and in too many cases, we're just seeing the state be ambivalent about the cost for people who are incarcerated. And how we know this is we're seeing an uptick in the number of people who are incarcerated with technical parole violations still during the pandemic. So in the beginning, in early March and in April, there was efforts to be made to reduce the jail population. However, over the last few months, we're seeing an increase in the number of people who are being held in for curfew violations, for failing to report of a change of address. And that it really smacks of I think, both ignorance and also apathy towards the cost of these people's health and these people's lives for nonsensical reasons.
Yeah, Elizabeth, your reporting really bore that out. Can you talk about this, the U curve that Phil just mentioned? Can you drill down on, to my mind, the pandemic has not gone away. I don't know if anybody else is living in a world where the pandemic has gone away. If so, can I move to where you are? But yeah, Elizabeth, take us through the U curve.
Yeah, that's a great question, Emily. And it's exactly as Phil said. So at the start of the pandemic, there was a steep decrease in people being detained for suspected technical parole violations in New York City. And what I mean by that is a person has actually just been accused of something like missing curfew. And I should say, of course, right, it's obviously a human rights crisis. to detain someone at any point, pandemic or not, for something like missing curfew, failing to report a change in employment. But during the pandemic, of course, right, ending this practice took on even more urgency because, as we all know, and as you know, the governor of New York and all elected officials were warned last March, COVID-19 can and does spread rapidly inside jails and prisons. And as Phil said, you know, the first known person to die of COVID-19 at Rikers Island was Michael Tyson, who is being held on a suspected technical parole violation. So when we look at the numbers, what we see is at the end of last March, there were about 650 people detained for suspected technical parole violations in New York City alone. Then there was a huge drop off. And by June, less than 200 people were detained. But what's really concerning is that the numbers started to creep back up in December. And as of March 1st, there were 264 people detained, which is actually the highest number of detentions since April, according to an analysis by the Vera Institute of Justice.
I recall this conversation well in New York, where people were urging Governor Cuomo to let people out, were really begging for the lives of people who were elderly or in on technical violations or like within a few months of release anyway. Like, we're coming home no matter what. Can we please get people out before they die of a pandemic? Senator Salazar, I would really love your take on sort of like the broader conversation on decarceration, because when I think of that conversation with Governor Cuomo, it was a bit shocking, you know, how reasonable the asks were and how little traction they were getting in state leadership. So I'd love your take on kind of where your peers stand on decarceration, as, you know, as it relates to technical violations, but also more generally as it relates to very reasonable ways to reduce prison populations. Is there going to be lip service with no action? Is there not even going to be lip service? Should I have more hope? Like, where should I be on this?
I am hopeful about proposals, decarceral proposals this year and in the years ahead, because I think legislators and the public are beginning to understand incarceration as a public health crisis. And truthfully, it was a public health crisis even before the pandemic because of just the domino effect, the ripple effect, the impact that incarceration has on communities. And so I'm really hopeful. There is a lot of promising legislation that is moving. The Less is More Act is very important, but additionally, elder parole, fair and timely parole, these are pieces of legislation that are designed to release people without compromising public safety, because truthfully, often incarceration is actually a threat to public safety. It exacerbates violence and underlying issues. So I'm very hopeful. I think people are starting to understand the harms of incarceration more holistically and are proposing legislative solutions, ways of changing the law in order to decarcerate and move away from incarceration as a a proposed solution for problems that we see in society.
So Vincent, when I listen to Senator Salazar, she sounds so reasonable. And the things we are talking about today are so ludicrous, you know, doing all of the harm and like violence of incarceration to someone who wanted to get married to someone they love who had a record, or, you know, wanted to live with their mother. As a former public defender, I can say I've actually had cases where I was fighting for a client to live in a safer place that was, for some technical reason, unacceptable to the department, in my case of probation. And you were the head of the New York City Department of Probation. So I'm wondering if you can give us some insight. Like, after listening to this whole episode, I kind of don't understand how anyone could disagree with us, but I know that there are people in corrections in the department, sort of on the correctional side, who are fighting to continue spending resources in this way. And I'm wondering if you could just explain, like, what's the argument? Why is that? Why are people even trying to continue doing this?
It's such a fascinating question. When I became commissioner of probation, I had never worked in probation before. I had run nonprofits my whole life, and then I ran juvenile justice for Washington, D.C. But this was my first foray into probation. So that question you just asked was my question. Why are we doing this stuff that just seems so crazy? And so, you really put yourself in the for a second. And I think it's important for us to put ourselves in the position of somebody living in a homeless shelter because they can't live with their mother. But also, like, why would a reasonable PO care about that? And that was the question I had to answer, because otherwise I couldn't fix the problem. And so what I saw when I looked at my staff and when I look at the parole officers in New York State is it's an extraordinarily risk-averse environment to start with, right? Nobody wants a Willie Horton, from the governor to the head of the corrections to your supervisor and therefore to you. And so every time you don't revoke somebody, even when you think it's a sensible thing to do, you're running that risk. You never know what they're going to do, right? And that's the thing that POs walk to work with every day. Then resources. You don't have a place to put them to live. You don't really have easy access to treatment, employment. We're a much harsher society than we were prior to the advent of mass incarceration. So nobody wants to let them live in their apartment, public housing, all those things, right? They carry a stigma of violations. But there is one infinite resource available to you at the stroke of a pen: incarceration. All I got to do is write up a revocation, and the person's going to be locked up immediately in a local jail and probably in prison for a while. And so in a scenario that we've set up as a society, because I don't want to just blame the POs, as a society, we have set up a system that greases the skids back to incarceration for people, but really limits how much help can be provided to them on their own or by POs. And so, we're reaping what we sow on this right now. And that's why, when people talk about, maybe we should change the culture. No. Yes, we should change the culture, but the legislature needs to step up on this. The governor needs to step up on this, and they need to change the law so that resources flow in a direction of helping people rather than just trivially for us, depriving them of their liberty. It's not trivial for them, but it is trivial in terms of the bad acts they've allegedly committed. We shouldn't so trivialize people's liberty interests the way we do right now. It's appalling. And really, I think the place to fix that is in the legislature through bills like less is more, like Senator Salazar talked about, and some of that other legislation. We can't just lay this on POs for them to sort of fix things that the legislature is unwilling to touch.
So speaking of the triviality of the cause for harm and the severity of the harm it causes, Elizabeth, I'm wondering if you could close our show a bit by telling us what did happen to Shawn Dunn, who we heard about at the top of the show.
Sure. So Mr. Dunn, he was given a 4-month sentence for these parole violations, which we've talked about. And during that time, Emily, as you said, his sister died. He was unable to attend the funeral because he was required to show both his birth certificate and his sister's. His family was able to find his sister's, but not his. And so he was not allowed to go to the funeral, which I should note, it was only the funeral was scheduled for just a couple weeks before he was going to be released anyway. He was released in early February, and when we spoke and he was still at Rikers, he told me he was feeling very optimistic and hopeful about the future. He said, "I'm already in the lowest position in my life. The only place to go is to the top."
A phenomenal attitude from someone who has experienced such ridiculous harm from our system. Well, thank you all so much for your work on this, for joining us, for helping our audience understand the lunacy of the current state of New York parole violations and the hope that you all have expressed for the future. I hope to see you all back here again very soon, perhaps talking about wild progress that has been made.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So the takeaway here is that we have to remember what prisons actually do, right? 95% of people who experience incarceration come home. Basically everybody who goes in comes home. But what do they come home to? What are they coming home from? Prisons create a legacy of trauma. neglect, isolation, being cut off from your family, your friends, your employer, no ability to save money to get a place to live when you come home, and of course, your employment and educational future hopelessly hampered by a criminal record. So you're coming home to lack of opportunity, no job options, no place to live, but tons of supervision, tons of mandates, seemingly designed to set everyone up for failure. Normal human choices. We heard Vincent talk about, getting married or living with your mom can cause you to go back to prison. An order to get a job, a mandate to be employed where either no one will hire you or you get a job that is past curfew. That's a great job, but that messes you up as you cycle through PO after PO. An order to find housing, but the housing you find is unacceptable. And there's, of course, no funding to help people find housing and no ability to earn money while in prison. So this system is setting people up for failure and letting parole officers, whether out of fear or some kind of carceral mentality, play gotcha with people's lives. And we are talking about lives. As people die inside prisons and jails from COVID-19, we can no longer pretend that this is about safety. It is much, much more dangerous to be in a carceral setting in a pandemic than it is to be home staying out past curfew. The safety of thousands more of people in prison is being threatened every single day. And New York has, up until now, decided that it's okay to put people's lives on the line for security theater in the form of locking people up for staying out past 8 p.m. As we heard from Senator Salazar, that may change. But even if New York takes this essential first step toward bringing home the thousands of people who never should have been locked up in the first place and diminishing the use of incarceration going forward, this is just the first step in one state. You can follow the appeal live for updates on whether others follow suit, what happens next in this evolving conversation. I hope to be talking with you much more about this in days and weeks to come. It's a pleasure having you, and you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza, and this has been another episode of The Appeal Live.